Hey everyone, namaste, and thank you for joining in this evening for a conversation with my good friend Dr. Kaustubh Desikachar. So, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction about him for those of you who are not familiar with him. Please forgive me because I'm going to read it for you. So, Kaustubh is a renowned yoga teacher, yoga therapist, and author, continuing the classical yoga tradition of his grandfather T. Krishnamacharya and father T.K.V. Desikachar. Kaustubh began studying yoga when he was only 9 years old under his father and began teaching by the time he was 13. He has a dual master's degree from the renowned Birla Institute of Technology and Science and has a doctorate from the University of Madras. Kaustubh continues to conduct teacher training and therapist training programs across the globe, traveling 8 months of the year to Europe, China, and other countries. He has authored several books, too many to count, he says, but to name a few: Hatha Yoga Pradipika, To Serve with Love, a tribute to T.K.V. Desikachar, The Yoga of the Yogi, the legacy of Krishnamacharya. And now I welcome Kaustubh to open the session with one of his beautiful chants. The stage is yours.
Namaste. Namaste, everybody. Let's begin with a small chant of peace. Om Tachayyoravranīmahe Gatai Yajñāya Gatai Yajñapataye Daive Swasthirastu Naha Swastirmanushebyah Urdhvam Jighatu Bheshajam Shanno Astu Dvipade Shanchatushpade Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Namaste, friends, and I'm so happy to be here. Namaste, Shailaja. Thank you for organizing this conversation.
Namaste, Kaustubh, and thank you so much for the beautiful chant. Truly soothing, inspiring.
Good.
Okay, so I'm just going to go over a little bit about your grandfather, who really inspired me to the practice as well. Kaustubh's grandfather, the renowned T. Krishnamacharya, considered the father of modern yoga, revolutionized yoga in the 20th century and made it accessible for everyone. His students are the modern day icons of yoga: P.K. Iyengar, Pattabhi Jois of the popular Ashtanga Vinyasa tradition, his son, T.K.V. Desikachar, and Indra Devi, popularly credited with taking yoga to the West, especially to Hollywood. I'm just going to read out a tribute published to him in the Yoga Journal as Krishnamacharya's legacy. I found it very meaningful and very moving the first time I read it. In fact, I've even taken this excerpt and added it to my when I published my first book. So I just have to read it to all of you. You may have never heard of him, but Tirumalai Krishnamacharya influenced, or perhaps even invented your yoga. Whether you practice the dynamic series of Patabi Jois, the refined alignments of BK's Iyengar, the classical postures of Indra Devi, or the customized vinyasa of Desikachar, your practice stems from one source, a 5-foot, 2-inch Brahmin born more than 100 years ago in a small South Indian village. So, Kaustubh, I'm going to begin this session with a question about what it was to grow up, with such a legend. I know to you, he must have just been your grandfather, right? But what are your earliest memories of him? And what is that one outstanding, like when you connect to him as a yoga teacher, as a yoga practitioner, right? What is that one aspect of him that really, strikes out and speaks out to you even today?
So this is very difficult question because there are so many memories or thoughts that come when we talk about my grandfather, especially growing up in the same household for many. I was 14 till he was there. So there's many things that are coming out. But one thing that stands out as soon as you ask this question, and it is perhaps my earliest memory of my grandfather. I think I must have been about 5 or 6 years old, perhaps. My grandfather was well into his 90s. And this is perhaps the earliest memory I have. It's one day when I wake up very early in the morning. It's in the night time. It was still dark. I woke up because of the ringing of the traditional Indian bell. And it's a large bell that we have. It's a very large bell that he had, that he was using. And the bell was ringing so strong, and he was in the ground floor of the house. We were in the top floor, and it woke me up. So I walked down to see what it was. And actually, this is perhaps the earliest memory I also have of my brother, because as I saw my grandfather doing his puja, I saw my brother sitting with my grandfather as well. So somehow, this is the earliest memory. And what I think about this as remarkable is many people that I meet now, when they are already in their 50s or 60s, they already are thinking about, life is over. I have to retire, and I just have to wait for death knocking at my door. And here was a man who was 90 years old, still disciplined enough to wake up at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to do his routines and do his puja. Because usually he did the puja after he had done all the other things, like having his practice, yoga practice, then having his bath and other things, and then doing the puja. The puja usually is lasting about 1 hour plus. So he was still doing this at the age of 90 plus. Now he was probably 90. And that is showing a commitment to practice, commitment to discipline. And I think that is what makes all these yogis apart, that their dedication to practice is so fascinating. And related with that, I also have a connected memory, because it was not just a one-off thing. This was going on regularly. And at one moment in 1988, I remember his 100th birthday celebrations was conducted, and there was a very big conference that was done in the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, and more than 300-400 people came from all over India to attend this, and they were celebrating the completion of his 100 years. And the event ended quite late for him in the evening, which nowadays we may not think it's late, but it ended around 9 o'clock or so in the evening, which was well past his usual bedtime. And that was his 100th birthday. Next day morning, he was awake already at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock.
Oh my God.
Because for him, that was much more important than all these celebrations and this kind of thing. And what I feel, that is the mark of a yogi who is not giving up the practice at no point of time. No point of time. That's the thing.
So he never stopped.
Yeah.
Not even his 100th birthday celebration.
Yeah.
Okay. And, I've heard a lot about, how close you were to your father, right? He was your teacher and your guru as well. So could you describe what it was to learn with your father and what kind of a person was he?
This is even more challenging because I spent even more time with my father and even more closely with my father. And there's so many things that I could share about him, but one thing that I always keep coming back to is this concept called relationship. My father always believed in the view that yoga is a relationship, whether it's with the body or whether it's with the other people or whether it's with nature or things like that. So for me, that is what he exemplified. Every person that he would connect with was basically a unique relationship that he created, and that was the basic thing that I found so fascinating. With he connected with people at the level where they were, whether they were very well-known people or very common people or a child or a mentally handicapped person or a physically handicapped person or a mother or a daughter or anybody else. He connected with them at the level they were at, even with animals. And it's very fascinating because we used to have a dog called Tulsi, and it's my father who gave the name as well. And also, he would walk the dog every day as if it was his duty and his dharma to do so. And even if we were going with him, he would be the one who was always wanting to hold because he wanted to create that relationship with that dog as well. And I would say that Tulsi was probably only afraid of my father and myself and nobody else because he was a very naughty dog. But there was a very strong bond that he had with my father. So for me, that was the key aspect I remember and I value with my father is this concept called relationship. He would not compromise on the relationship, especially if it involved healing or if it involved teaching. For him, that was supremely important. All other things was not so important. I remember even there was an award ceremony back in the 90s, and he was supposed to be getting an award. And the just before the ceremony was beginning, he got a call that somebody was sick, and he basically told me to go with another one of my father's students, saying, "You guys go to the function and receive the reward. I have to attend this student, and that is more important." And of course, the people who organized the ceremony was so angry. But for my father, that was more important that he had to attend the health of a person than be celebrated for his achievement. And I think that is the key, that yoga is a relationship. And I think that is the most important thing. And relationship is always from the heart. And I have never seen another person in my life whose heart has been so open, even when other people who are receiving it, their heart have not been so open. My father was always giving a lot from his heart.
So,
Shaili, I'm getting a lot of messages that many people can't see this because you have to accept them as a friend before they see
okay,
it.
just give me a second. Yeah, I'm just accepting friend request. Okay. Yeah, I'm just doing that. I have accepted at least
You ask
10
your son.
friend requests now. Yeah, I think, yeah, at least 10 requests I've accepted right now. I hope everybody is in.
Yeah,
Yeah, all good?
I don't know, maybe.
Okay, shall we continue? Okay, so in case you get any more comments about people not being able to see us, just oh, okay, I can see this whole conversation going on. Oh yeah, okay. Fine.
One thing you can ask Vaishnav to do is to use another computer to activate your profile for public, not just friend circle.
Okay, I think it is activated to public. Vaishnav, just give me a second, yeah. Make it public.
Good.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so this is something that I'm asking for myself also. I'm quite curious about. So yoga is a big word today, and people all over the globe, from I think the caves of Himalayas or wherever it originated, till even I think Africa, Middle East, everywhere yoga has spread, right? But it's also diluted in many ways, and in lots of places it's just like an exercise, like a class they go once a week, or in so many other places it's like, okay, I have back pain, do yoga. It's like, some, I mean, therapy is good, but it's become only a therapy, right? So your expert view on what is yoga practice to you, like what does it mean to you, and like, you grew up with the best teachers of our time, and so you must be having a unique perspective to the practice, right?
Yeah. For me, yoga is a path for us to fulfill our full potential so that we are the best version of ourselves.
That is so beautiful. Sorry to interrupt you, but that was so beautiful.
No, it's okay. This is my personal view and my personal experience working with myself and also with the work I am doing with many of my students and practitioners that I teach. I think we all have some seed potential that we are endowed with from the time of conception. And yoga is a way to bring out that seed potential into fruition so that we are fulfilling this potential, we are fulfilling our talent, our full talent. And I think that is the key aspect of yoga. Yoga is not a physical fitness exercise. Yoga is not just some kind of gymnastics that many people are doing, or yoga is not necessarily like a religious cult that you have to belong to, but it's something that is a very universal path where we can use many different tools to bring out our full potential. There's nothing greater than that. And in the Vedic view and in the view of Patanjali from the yoga's point of view, Yoga Sutra point of view, we are not going to find liberation until we fulfill our potential. If we don't fulfill our potential, the concept of liberation is not going to happen. It's going to be elusive. And I think that is my personal take on what is yoga. And I hope that many people will pursue this as well, because this is the key thing that is missing today. Many people practice yoga as some form of physical fitness, and that is very, very limiting to the whole meaning of what is yoga. And I think that is what I would like everybody to remember.
So when it comes down to asana practice as well, right? Again, it's just like, stretch your muscles, tone tighten your core. It's just a very, very physically oriented practice in most places. So, and I know that there's so much more, so many more components to the practice besides just the physicality of the body, right? So, could you just elaborate a little bit more on the different elements that make up the yoga practice, the asana practice in particular?
See, yoga is actually not for the body at all. Patanjali is presenting yoga as a way to influence and shape our mind. Very beginning of the Yoga Sutra philosophy, Patanjali presents Vrittayaha, Panchatayaha, Klishtaha, Aklishtaha. That is, the mind is the source of problems and the mind is the solution for all problems. So, yoga is a mind oriented approach. Now, there are two steps. One is that yoga has to achieve the best potential in human beings, for which a disciplined mind is needed. So, the first stage is helping us from our disturbed and distracted state of mind to come to that state of mind that is called a samadhi, where the mind reaches a state of quietness or calmness. But samadhi itself is not the goal. Samadhi is a stepping stone for reaching the higher potentials of fulfilling our dharma and then seeking finally liberation. So, in order to go there, in order to reach samadhi, it's not possible for most of us with such high levels of distraction and disturbance to just go to samadhi as if it was a next door destination. So that is why Patanjali is presenting a lot of tools which helps us to get closer and closer to samadhi. And that is why Patanjali is presenting in the second chapter, which is especially targeted for people who are having a highly disturbed mind, like many of us in the modern era. The Ashtanga Yoga, the eight-limb path, where we talk about the yamas and niyamas, which are about attitudes that we have to develop, which is very, very important, and restraints that we have to develop, which is called the niyamas, certain disciplines, certain things that we must avoid to do, certain things that we should control and discipline ourselves. And then comes asana practice, so that the body does not become a disturbance for the mind. Just think about it. If you have back pain, all you're going to be thinking about is your back, and your mind is not going to be focused. You're going to keep thinking, oh, when is it going to happen? When is it going to get better? Why is it that I have back pain? Why should it happen to me? Why not to me? Oh, when is it going? All these concerns in the physical body will influence the mind. Then he talks about pranayama, which is breath regulation, because breath and mind are very strongly interconnected. Then sensory discipline, because sensory control is very, very key, because we live in a very sensually distracting era, and we know how sensory objects can pull us in 100 different directions. And if sensory distractions are going to be existing, then our mind is not going to be focused. Therefore, he talks about certain ways in which we are restraining the senses. Then comes the different stages of meditation, dharana, dhyanam, eventually leading to samadhi. All these are part of yoga, of the Ashtanga Yoga of Mr. Patanjali. However, even apart from that, he gives many more techniques in the first chapter that include things like mantra practice, things like connection with the divine, things like inquiry into the role of dreams and sleep and things like that. And then he leaves a very universally open path where he says, Yatha Abhimata Dhyanadva. Whatever method is going to help us to discipline the mind and calm the mind, we have to be open to do. So Patanjali is actually presenting a multifaceted platform for yoga practice. And it is a sad thing that most people are affected only or influenced only by asana practice, and that too not even as part of yoga, but as physical exercises. The way asana is taught in the modern era is actually anti-yoga. Because yoga is talking about bringing together body, breath, and mind, whereas most people, the way they practice yoga is like a stretching, where they're watching some TV or watching each other, competing with each other, and that is really anti-yoga. And that's why the modern yogis, the modern yoga practitioners, even though they are practicing for 10 years, 20 years, 15 years, they still don't find the best out of them. They still keep going to the worst, because the way they practice yoga is nourishing more the ego rather than the spirit.
Well said. So this is again one of my pet topics, and something that I've heard you speak very eloquently about this whole concept of dharma and swadharma. I think most of us, me included, till at least a while ago, we spend much of our lives searching for purpose. Yeah, we all feel like we are born with this purpose. We need to find this purpose. What is the purpose of our life? And some of us are lucky. I think we find or we create a purpose. But for a lot of people, this is something a huge quest, right? It's almost like a lifetime quest. So, how does yoga help us find our dharma? And what is there like some signposts, or if you find your dharma, does you some synchronicities, or does something happen? How do you know that that is your dharma even if you find it? Just some light on dharma.
My grandfather answers this question through a composition called Dhyana Malika. There is a verse there. Dharmanna drishti pranavai shuddha yoga vibodakaha iti siddha prakurvanti sadakala mashritaha. Don't focus on dharma as an obsession. Just focus on the breathing, because anything that deviates your breath is a sign that you are moving away from your dharma. So the more you are even teaching yoga as an egoistic practice, as a egoistic yoga teacher, you will see that your breath will become shorter and shorter. Whereas if it is your dharma, you are doing it from your heart, your breath will become more and more longer and more smoother. Following our natural instinct is what yoga teaches us. And when we follow our natural instincts, we are never going to be in trouble. It's only when we are deviating from our natural instincts that we are going to be in trouble. The only time our breathing must become short and restless is when we are actually in danger. When we are chased by an animal, for example, that is when the ancient people actually had disturbances of breathing. At all other times, their breath was very calm. Whereas nowadays, we are so afraid even of a little WhatsApp message. Even that is so fearful. So imagine the kind of deviation we have come from our natural state to such an unnatural state where we are allowing the breath to become shorter and shorter. So dharma is by definition what is inherent in our nature. The more we follow that inherent nature, the more we will become closer to our fulfilling our dharma. And we must not listen to what other people say or what other people think about us or things like that. We have to somehow be strong to listen to that inner voice without any fear, without any distraction. And that is why yoga becomes a very powerful ally, because again, it's in the mind, the heart mind. Because when we discipline the mind becomes stronger. It gets established in its true nature. Tada drashtuhu swarupe avasthanam. It gets established, the mind and the consciousness, they get established in their true nature. It's not going to deviate just because somebody else wants you to deviate or somebody else wants you to do something different. A cat cannot be a dog cannot be a monkey cannot be a giraffe. The same way, each one of us, we cannot be something else just because our mother or father wants us to be something else. And human beings are the big culprits here. We, especially parents, are the big culprits here, because parents do not encourage children to be in their natural state. They push them to deviate from their natural state. Just think about it. If you think about what parents want their children to study, the most intelligent kids are always asked to study lawyer, engineering, medicine, computer science, etc. No parent tells their most intelligent child, study spirituality, study philosophy. In the old days, the most intelligent people went to spirituality, went to philosophy, whereas today, the leftovers go to spirituality, the leftovers go to all these interesting subjects, because the most intelligent people are pushed by the parents to go after what will give more money. And that is the biggest blunder parents have made and are continuing to make. And I hope this changes. We need people to pursue what is natural, not what is unnatural.
That is such a hard one.
It's very
And
easy.
especially, I mean, we come from India where this is so rampant, and I think parents feel like they're doing. The thing is, they don't even see it as something wrong, right? They believe it's part of their parental obligation to force their children to do. I mean, ultimately, everything is just about money, making a living. I'm not saying that's not important, but
Yeah,
somehow that seems to be the
yeah.
underlying.
Yeah, but this has all happened in the last 100 years, if not lesser. And we have to look at this as an aberration in our society. And all aberrations will come back to a correction sooner or later. And if you look at only the last 100 years, these things have happened. It's not there before. So it is an aberration in society, and it is probably going to get corrected. And perhaps the corona is one way of this aberration getting corrected, where people start realizing what is the real priority.
Yeah, but I think society really needs to change at a very deep level to release that conditioning that money is the criteria for success. So you're judged really. I mean, these days you're judged everywhere by the amount of money you make, and a lot has to go to change that conditioning.
That can only change when you don't let it affect you. When you don't
Absolutely.
let money to affect you, only then it will change. If you keep falling for the same trap and expecting different consequences, that's actually called insanity, because that is like repeating the same thing but expecting different consequences. That's insanity. And if we keep doing the same thing, that's not going to help. So that's why if you really want to fulfill your dharma, seek liberation, you have to pursue what is natural, not what is unnatural. And money is something that is very unnatural to human beings. It's very unnatural. We didn't come with that. It's a creation of human beings. No other species in the world uses money as a commodity. There is no cat or dog that is using money as a commodity. There are no birds, not even the most closest relative to us, the monkeys, the gorillas, or the chimpanzees. They don't use money. It's only human beings who are using this. And I think that is the biggest problem. It's a
And
problem. It's not easy,
it
but
is, it is, it is
something we have to
absolutely.
redefine.
Yeah. And I was also hearing you in another talk where you talked very nicely about how even if you follow your dharma, it doesn't always mean that it's going to bring you a lot of material prosperity. And you were actually quoting your grandfather's life also, and saying that he also struggled at many points in his life. So maybe you can just share that as well. That doing your dharma does not automatically mean that material success is going to follow, but the important thing is to really believe in it and find satisfaction in some other way besides money.
I think at the end of the day, if we are going to think that money is going to make us happy, it's not. What is going to make us more happy is connections, really, connection to family, connection to friends, connection to the divine. And that is what my grandfather had. He was very wealthy in these domains. He was not so wealthy in financial terms. He never went after money because he wanted to do what is right in his conscience. He wanted to do what is right in his conscience. And I think this is something that we have to re-evaluate, because doing our dharma is not necessarily connected with financial success. Financial success is a societal concept that has been manufactured in the last few hundred years. Of course, money has been there before that, but nobody related dharma to a job like in traditional times. There was no retirement age from dharma. There's a retirement age for job. There's an office for job, but dharma is something that is way beyond all this. So we have to understand that doing our dharma need not always mean that we will always get a lot of money for this. There may be projects that bring in a lot of success. And there may be projects that need not bring in a lot of success. Take the case of, forget about my grandfather, take the case of modern writers, for example. You take the lady who wrote the book Eat, Pray, Love, Elizabeth Gilbert. She wrote a fantastic book and it was a big success. But her Dharma is a writer. She wrote 2 other books that did not get the same success that the first one did. But who cares? She probably is satisfied in her heart that these 2 projects also manifested. That is more important than how much money these projects are going to give. That's the problem. And we live in a modern society where we have this very delicate relationship with money because we have made it as a necessary instrument when actually it is not so necessary. It is necessary to one limit, but there is something life beyond money as well. That is what we have to focus on.
Okay, thank you. I think there are many questions coming up on all this, but maybe we'll take them later. And this other next question also is something that's very relevant in these COVID times that we live in, on yoga and how does it help build immunity, right? The new word is immunity. Everybody talks about, to make sure that you don't catch the virus, like, boost your immunity, like eat the right foods. So how does yoga help?
See, that itself reveals the stupidity of the society we live in. It's not true that only COVID needs a strong immunity. Any disease for that matter, you need a strong immune system, whether it is...
The COVID has highlighted it. Let me just put it that way. The need for the strong immunity, right?
Yes, that's the problem, because we seem to look at all these as fashion trends. The fashion trend of 2020 is COVID.
It's COVID.
And that's the problem. And even though it's not supposedly 20 because it's still COVID-19, but it's caught on fire in 2020. And the thing about yoga is the central tool of yoga is prana, which is so strongly connected with the breathing mechanism. And so, if we practice yoga correctly with the connection to breathing, then naturally the immune system will get revitalized because the prana system connects with the lungs, the hearts, which are very strongly connected with the immune system. So the more calmer we breathe, the more longer we breathe, the more vitalized the immune system will become. And since you talk about COVID, it is attacking the respiratory system. So that's why yoga is so good to practice in these COVID times, because when we practice yoga with a careful attention to the breathing, there is no doubt that the immune system will definitely see some improvement, and it will facilitate the better healing of the person. Of course, it may not be enough that we just do the breathing exercise. If somebody is affected with this, they may have to take other forms of intervention as well, and they must consult their doctors for that. But definitely, the breathing exercises can contribute very significantly to the improvement of the immune system. That's one thing. The second thing, the immune system always functions better when the metabolic system is healthy. When you think about it, even when you get a slight fever, your digestion disappears, you stop being hungry. And the moment you start feeling hungry, you know that your fever is coming down. So metabolic system and immune system are very strongly connected. So when we think about it this way, if we can do certain asanas, for example, the asanas that are centered around the digestive system, like twists, lateral bends, forward bends, etc., that can vitalize the metabolic system, the immune system will in turn also become much more stronger, because at the end of the day, the metabolic system finally produces prana, which is what is ultimately needed to fight any kind of disease as well. energy is needed. So that will boost the immune system as well. That's another approach. The last thing I want to say is that immune system also works better when we are more relaxed rather than when we are more stressed. So, if we practice yoga in a way that it reduces our stress levels, our anxiety levels, etc., the immune system will also find great improvement. So, if we take this three-pronged approach, and even if each of these approaches only improves our immune system by 10%, we still have a 30% improvement in our immune system, which may be very good enough to fight any kind of illnesses that are coming to us in a good manner. Of course, it's not necessarily enough, but this is something which can contribute very successfully. So that's why it's a very good time for people to start practicing yoga. In one way, this is a positive for yogis that the corona has come, because more people will benefit from yoga.
So in terms of pranayama practice, is there anything in specific that you would recommend? Like, is it longer inhales, longer exhales, alternate breathing? What would you
In
recommend?
the beginning stages, I think the best is to extend the exhalation, because that will bring our system to a more relaxed state, and that in turn will have a significant effect on all other parameters. So start with the extension of exhale, then proceed with the extension of inhale, and only then start to bring in some retention after exhale first, then inhale. Systematically, that is the order that will be the best now.
Okay. And in terms of the different kinds of pranayama, like alternate nostril, Ujjayi, Kapalabhati, is there anything in particular you would recommend?
In this moment, I think the pranayama like Ujjayi pranayama or the Nadi Shodhana pranayama, Surya Bhedana pranayama, these kind of techniques will be very helpful, because the classical texts talk about them having a very direct influence on the metabolic system. However, if people have certain problems like congestion in the throat, etc., then Ujjayi must be avoided, and other types of pranayama can be utilized as well.
And in the beginning, like, there are lots of people listening. So what would you recommend? Like, how many minutes or how many times do they do it? Some guidelines to that? If somebody's just starting off.
I think to do about 12 breaths 3 times a day is enough. Once in the morning, once in the midday, once in the evening time, that's a good starting point. And it's also very significant, because when people take those breaks from their normally stressful routines, the body also goes into a relaxation at that time.
So thank you so much, Kaustubh, for that. Now, this is from a student, Nirmala. How can one overcome anxiety and fear through practicing yoga? Are there any specific asanas or breathing techniques to help? Like, mental health has become such a big issue, right? People, I mean, I think it was always there. It's just that people talk more about it now. So, I mean, besides fear and anxiety, I would add loneliness, depression, all these negative emotions that we all feel at different points during our lives and different degrees as well. So, what is your, opinion on how we can deal with it through pranayama or any specific asanas?
So, fear is a very normal state for all of us for survival. But when fear becomes systemic, that's when we have problems like anxiety and panic attack and phobias and things like that. And a very big problem with these things are that they are not rational. They are often very irrational, because it's the nature of all these situations. What triggers these fears, we don't know. But how yoga understands this is that when we have some kind of chronic anxiety or phobias or things like that, it basically means that the vata system has become aggravated. The neurological system, which is controlled by the vata, this has become aggravated. And it's almost like our system is running on that vata software. It's like, you have an iPhone that runs on Apple software, Google phone runs on Google software, etc. Our body runs on a particular software that changes from time to time, which is called the gunas. Now, when there is chronic anxiety or phobias and things like that, it basically means that some virus has taken over the software of our body where the vata gets aggravated. So, what we are doing in yoga is the opposite. We bring in the opposite of vata, that is the kapha, where we make the neurological system more grounded, more stable. And so, we use again breathing techniques like exhalation, extension of exhalation, mantras that are called Langana mantras like the Shanti mantra, etc., which ground the person. Asanas done in a static manner, especially asanas that are like simple, gentle forward bends, etc., that allows the person to ground themselves. When we do that, then the software changes. It may not be very smooth and natural. In some cases, it may become worse before it becomes better. But we need repetition again and again to change that software so that the Vata software is not continuing its activity. So that is the approach, a very simple approach that we would take that is very general for a general audience now. Having said that, there are also things that we have to consider because all these fears and anxieties and other things could be triggered by factors that we have inherited from our ancestors or inherited from past experiences like trauma and things like that. In such cases, we really have to take a step one-to-one approach. We cannot really take a general overall approach where one system or one solution will work for all. But generally speaking, we need to change the software of our system from the vata aggravated guna to make it a little less aggravated so that the fear and anxiety are not triggered. That's the way we approach it.
So this is not a very specific question, but it touches on Indian philosophy since you brought up, past traumas and all that. Somebody had also had a similar question on karma, right? So how does karma come into this? Like, is it something like our fears, are they aggravated like unconsciously through things that happened to us in the past? Or
Yeah, one of the theories is that we also have karmic inheritance from our ancestors. And for those who believe in past life, we also have karma from past life that we bring on to this life, and that is a much more difficult topic to address generally because each one's karma is very different. Even people in the same family need not inherit the same karma. So it's not so easy to address it. However, it's a very relevant and often significant concept that we have to work with, and it has impact on our health. Ayurveda text talks about this. Purva janma kritam papam vyadhirupena badhyate. The sins that we have committed in the previous karma, previous time that we existed, manifest in the form of illnesses in the present. Now, whether we believe it or not, whether it's scientific or not, now modern scientists are now talking about transgenerational trauma, transgenerational illnesses, hereditary illnesses, which is in some way what the ancient people were talking about, just using the word karma. So it just doesn't become acceptable just because we use a Western word called hereditary or transgenerational disease. This has been discussed in detail in Ayurveda philosophy and also accepted by yoga, Buddhist philosophy as well, because they're all very interconnected.
Okay, this is from Mini. There are many questions on meditation. So a lot of misconceptions around the term meditation. A lot of people think yoga and meditation are separate practices. So just a brief overview on what is meditation. And then she also has this question that a lot of teachers tell you that you have to stop, the flow of your thoughts. So she says, isn't the flow of your thoughts very natural? And, how can you stop the flow of your thoughts if you're meditating? So just some light on meditation.
Meditation is not separate from yoga. Actually, meditation is yoga. Actually, one of the definitions of yoga is dhyanam. Yogaha sannahana upaya dhyana sangati yuktishu. In the Amarakosha, one of the most ancient dictionaries of Sanskrit language, one of the definitions of yoga is dhyanam, meditation. Now, what is meditation? Meditation is a process where, especially in yoga, is a process where we choose an object of meditation and build a very deep connection from the heart to the object of focus, where we are keeping the focus, we're keeping the connection to the focus very strong. So basically, there is confusion about this because when you want to make that connection with somebody or some object of focus, you have to disconnect from others. Right? If I want to choose to go to visit one friend, I have to choose not to visit other friends at that moment. So that is what is the meaning of letting go of the distractions of the mind, so that the entire attention of the mind is on the object of focus. It is connected to that object of focus. That is what is meditation. So by no means meditation is a passive process, it's a very active process. So meditation is not stopping the thoughts, it's stopping the distractions to the focus that we want to choose to focus on. So there's a lot of misconception about this, especially because a lot of yoga people and Buddhist people, there is a lot of intermixture in these concepts. And yoga and Buddhism, while sharing a lot of commonalities, they also have a lot of differences which are very fundamental. And one of the fundamental differences that Buddhist view have a view that is called Kshanika Vada. That means everything is momentary and it's a creation of the mind. Whereas yoga is actually talking in the opposite direction. Yoga is saying everything is real. It's belonging to the school called Sattvada. Patanjali talks about Sattvada and Parinama, the school of realism. It's not the school of momentary conception that the Buddhists take, that is called Kshanika Vada. There's another fascinating difference, which is for Buddhist view, the mind is a very central and perhaps the most important thing. That's why they talk about this, even the Enlightenment, as the concept of one mind. Whereas in the yogic view, mind is merely an instrument of the consciousness. So in yogic view, meditation is not by the mind. Meditation is done by the consciousness using the mind as an instrument. Whereas in Buddhist view, meditation is a function of the mind. And there is no self in Buddhism. Consciousness is not accepted by Buddhist view. So therefore, mind is a very central point of view. And therefore, the concept that you have to negate the mind, you have to chop the mind off its activities, they have to present that view. That is a different approach than the yogic approach, where it is not saying you have to negate all your thoughts. Actually saying you have to use the mind to focus on one thing so that the consciousness can be in connection to that object of focus. So there are a lot of differences, and that differences creates confusion. Now, it doesn't mean that one school is better than the other. What's important is when you take the Buddhist school, you have to take that approach. You must not mix it with yoga. When you take the yogic view, you must take the yogic view. You must not mix it with Buddhist approach. They are not necessarily compatible because there are certain fundamental concepts that are different. Buddhism does not accept Atma, Purusha, Ishvara, etc., whereas those are so fundamental for yoga philosophy. You cannot mix these two together and put them in the same pot. That's what has happened now. A lot of people are mixing Buddhism and yoga, and that's why there is so much confusion.
Okay, so thanks so much, Kaustubh. I'm just looking into the questions just before we wind up. So, some questions here we've already covered on karma and on meditation. And there's one here from Seema, and she says, is it necessary, I think, to have a purpose in life and to live a happy life, not harming anyone? Is there anything deficient in it?
Okay, there are multiple questions in this question. First of all, the question, is it necessary to have a purpose in life? It's actually uh, it's like an oxymoron. It's actually the opposite. It's because we have a purpose in life that we are having a life. We don't have a life without a purpose. This is the Vedic and yogic view, and also as the Oriental view. So the question should actually be the opposite. What is the purpose of life? Rather than is it necessary to have a purpose of life? Just because we have a life, it's a sign that we have a purpose in life. Now, the second question is it not what did you say, to live a happy life and not harming? Is that
Yeah,
any?
so isn't it just okay to, right, to have a happy life, just not harm anybody? Is like basically is purpose necessary?
First of all, there is absolutely no way that we are going to have a life that is always happy. There will be ups and downs of life. This is the reality of life. And we cannot guarantee that we cannot harm anybody. The intention may be not to harm anybody, but that somebody will be harmed or not, we cannot guarantee. Because no matter what we do, somebody or the other will be harmed because you take one view, somebody else sees the view differently. So the purpose of life is not just to live a life without harming anybody. Then why the hell do we exist? We exist because we have a dharma and a purpose to fulfill, and each one we have to contribute to that purpose in life. That is very, very central. Whatever that role is, there is a purpose in life. Otherwise, why do we have to educate ourselves? Why do we have to have a relationship with a partner, have children, educate them and grow them, etc.? There is a purpose we have, and that is what we have to fulfill.
And I have another question here from another student, Tanuja. Can you touch a little bit more on intuition?
Touch.
Well, maybe, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe this touches on the chakras, maybe the Agnya.
Intuition is a very key concept that is talked about in yoga. There are many words that they are giving. It's actually the more relevant topic is about perception, because yoga talks about multiple levels of perception, yogika pratyaksha. Then there is what is called vikarana bhava, then pratibha, then yogika pratyaksha. There are different levels of these things. And intuition is an awareness that is coming that is not dependent on the senses. That's why one of the words that is used is what is called vikarana bhava. A perception that is not dependent on the senses, but it comes from a deep connection to that light that is within. And there are different levels of this. When we connect with our light and we are able to listen to that inner voice, because the mind, the ego, the fears, the anxieties, all those have come down, we are able to have that knowledge that is coming from within, and it is given to everybody. Intuition is not something that some people have, some people don't have. Intuition is something that is given to everybody. Whether we use it or not, that's different. Now, at an extreme level, intuition can be extended to what is called as yogika pratyaksha, which is perception through a connection. So let's say I'm very deeply connected with somebody from a heart to heart, without words, without any kind of exchange of normal sensory transactions, just that connection will allow us to know what the other is feeling. That is what is called Yaugika Pratyaksha. And it's even more fascinating because in that moment, if that person is connected to somebody else in their heart, we are able to see what even that person is able to feel. So that is what is called Yaukika Pratyaksha. It transcends space and time because of connection. So there are different levels of perception that we can achieve through refinement of our mind and more deeper connection to our heart. And I think that is what we all have to remember. And when we do that, even answering the previous question, you will know what your life purpose is. You will definitely know what your life purpose is, because we all are here for a reason. We are not here for no random reason.
So I think it's already an hour, so we should be winding up this session. And maybe just before we wind up, if people are interested in getting in touch with you, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the online courses that you conduct and how they could get in touch with you.
Well, if anybody wants to know more about my work, I will share the link of my webpage at the end of this uh, session, and you can take a look at it. But I also want to remind everybody that Shailaja, you yourself are a very good teacher and you have written a very nice book. So you must share your information as well so people have access to that. And
Thank you so
what is even more important that I want each one of you to remember is take this time to reflect about what is the priority in your life. Don't try to think that you have to go back to the new normal, which is the same situation as it was before the coronavirus. You must think about what is it that is your priority in life, and try to think about the connections that you share with your family, with your friends, and with yourself. And most importantly, your purpose of life. What is the priority? And start focusing on that, because that is what will help us to live a more meaningful life. The ancient systems, no matter whether it's from India or other countries, they never pursued happiness as a principle. They pursued a purpose, dharma, whether it's Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, and any other pagan tradition you go, everyone focuses on this concept called dharma, the purpose of our life. This is not something we have to forget. Nobody pursued happiness because they knew happiness was a momentary principle. Happiness cannot exist without suffering. They are two sides of the same coin. You can't have happiness all the time. It's impossible. Purpose is much more important. And that is what all traditional systems, no matter which country of origin, focused on. So, no matter what belief system you follow, no matter whether you follow yoga or Buddhism or Jainism or any other system traditionally, you will see that purpose of life is the most important priority. So, please focus on that, my friends. It's a great gift that Corona has given us time and space to reflect on these questions. So please do that. Namaste.
So thank you so much, Kaustubh, and thank you all of you. I mean, it's great to see so many of you show up, including my aunt Shantanti, who's there. I see her name here. So thank you so much. I really hope. I mean, I truly love and have great passion for yoga. It's changed my life, shifted my life, and Kaustubh is one of the greatest people to have a conversation with to spread authentic information about yoga. Yeah, so I'm really happy to do this, and I really hope that you guys have benefited from this. Yeah, thank you.
Namaste.